I would like to go ahead and call to order the January 19th, 2022 Gig Harbor Parks Commission special meeting. Start with a roll call. Ben Coronado, Parks Commission Chair. Mary Barber, Vice Chair.
Here.
And Stephanie Lyle. And Louise Tiemann.
Here.
And Georgina Armstrong.
Here.
Will Appleton.
Here.
And Anastasia Wright.
Here.
And from the city, we have Parks Manager Matthew Keel. And Public Works Assistant Terry Garrison.
Here.
And then from Conservation Techniques, Stephen Duke.
Here.
All right. So today we're here to talk about the draft pros plan that we received last week, and hopefully everybody had time to look through it and read through most of it and provide some conversation pieces, and hopefully we can build some consensus on how we move forward with this tonight. You know, we're looking, I think, to kind of stay big picture in this. There might be some minor edits that you caught on the way through it, but ideally we're going to stick to bigger picture items and see if it's ultimately what we want to say with this document from what we've heard from the community. And we have Steve here to help us kind of go through this conversation and maybe, you know, provide some input, and then Matthew is going to help us, you know, facilitate the conversation. So I think to start off with, you know, we've all got plenty of background on it. I don't know, Stephanie and Georgina, I know Georgina's done a fair amount of background information on this. Stephanie, how versed are you in the pros plan? Are you pretty well up to speed on it, or would it be better to kind of get a background on it a little bit? Oh, you're on mute.
Always happens. I've read through the whole thing, so I have a pretty good sense of what's happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think just to start off with, I mean, Steve, great job on you know, last draft, and the city staff, I know, you know, provided a lot of input on it, and I think it's looking really good. I personally, it's come a long ways, and I really like what it has to say so far. So from here, we're going to take an opportunity for every Parks Commissioner to, you know, provide input. So we're just going to kind of go round robin style, and everybody have an opportunity to weigh in, and hopefully we can, you know, provide some input to Steve moving forward if necessary. So if anybody doesn't want to go ahead and start, I kick it right off to Mary. Yep.
I'll start. I know, surprise, surprise. No, I echo Ben's comments. I think that this was a great draft. I really like the way that the layout, the flow of the document is. It's much easier to read through. Sticking big picture, and I've talked to Matt about a couple of these things already too. Chapter 6, that I think is the culture and events section, is one that I would like to have us do some more work on. And I think that Matt is going to work with Laura Pettit in the communications department to help with that. To me, kicking it off with us saying that we're doing cultural tourism, and it may be because of my having lived in Alaska as long as I did, we're not doing cultural tourism, in my opinion, in the city yet. We should be, and I think it's an aspirational goal, but I don't believe that we are, and I'd like to kind of rework that, and Laura can probably help us figure out how to best do that as well. And part of the reason that I feel that way is because the other big thing that I would like to see done is incorporating our burgeoning relationship with the Puyallup tribe and our history with the Puyallup tribe into the plan more. As I mean, we also history with logging and fishing and that kind of thing. But I think that we've just started this big project with the Puyallup tribe, and we need to somehow incorporate that into it. One of the things is including the honoring project that's going to be at the Austin Park. And the other thing is really just talking about how we renamed the Austin Estuary Park to Austin Park to Walcott Estuary and that kind of thing. So I'd like to be able to see that incorporated in the document kind of throughout, so that we have that tie to history and culture. Those are my two big things.
And thank you, Mary. I appreciate you jumping out there and providing that. So, and just to give a little more background on the, Matthew had just sent out an email kind of laying out the format for the meeting tonight. So we're going to try and keep this bigger picture, conversation to the first hour of the meeting. And then we're going to have Jeff come in and we're going to talk about the capital improvements list once he's able to join us at 7 o'clock. So, I mean, we can, converse until then, but even further if we need to. But that's kind of when Jeff's jumping in to help us out with that Appendix A item. So would anybody else like to jump out and go first? Georgina or Louise or?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay.
So to start off, I just want to say how impressed I was with this and what's been accomplished so far. It was a good read. It was long, but it was good. I'm especially pleased with the sections on land conservation, sustainable stewardship practices, open flex space management plan, water conservation, and overall climate resilient practices. It was really good to see how they fleshed out. I was really pleased about those. So I have some questions and comments, and Steve can help me on this, I'm sure, just to see where certain things fit in, or maybe if we could add a little bit more policy language in some areas. So I'll go through them. The first is, what is the best way to determine why an amenity is no longer of interest? As in whether it is the park itself, the condition of the equipment, the presence of a similar amenity in another park or an HOA nearby, or if there is a new trend that the public is interested in. The reason I'm asking this is the concern that I have that visiting parks with playgrounds, at least as an example, a few times a week received an F at 45.5%. So is it advisable that there be steps taken to assess what the problem is before continuing to build, in this case, new playgrounds, so that we don't repeat the mistake if a mistake indeed happened? Can we add some policy language to the pros plan about taking that step? I walk around Harbour Hill community quite a lot, and I go into the different HOAs, and they have some really good playgrounds. So it's possible on that one topic of playgrounds that maybe people are enjoying more the close proximity of those playgrounds in their HOA, and they're competing a little unfairly then to the local parks where they'd have to get in a car and drive to them. And that maybe they're looking for something that they don't have in their little local playground area. So did you want to, are we going through this one at a time, or do we talk about that? Or
Georgina, I think it'd be fantastic. First, that was a great comment and your question's great, but let's make sure we get all the questions and kind of fleshed out, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'm not limiting your time, but if everybody gets a chance to get out what is of interest and of questions, yeah.
Okay, so I'll go on to the next one. Yeah,
please.
Yeah, okay. So the next one is, I was wondering if we could add some wording so that there is a stated priority for finding a way to achieve connectivity for Harbour Hill to the waterfront through a system of trails and sidewalks. I know that is pretty clear that phase 5 of the Cushman Trail is a priority and that it's spelled out, but it was made clear from the survey results and specific comments made by respondents that people in North Gig Harbour feel removed or out of touch with the waterfront and downtown. So I would like to see Harbour Hill mentioned somewhere if that's possible. Another is it possible to include a policy statement that it's the city's objective to create a well-rounded park, open space and recreation system? This would then also allow for less specific development in situations where more flexibility is desirable. I know that it's common for metrics to be used to determine how much of these areas a city needs, but I think that a metric system can sometimes fall short because it's somewhat formulaic by nature, and that doesn't leave room for allowing the public to use a park flexibly by adapting the space to suit their own purposes and for the city to consider more imaginative uses for the park. Personally, I like the idea of the classic park design, whereby you have flexible space for people to start their own games. When a lot of those parks still has some form of amenity like a children's playground, the park provides the public with a large area to determine how they will use it for recreation. And then a playground in the park gets more attention because it has a lot of people there for a variety of reasons where they are choosing to participate in whatever it is they want to participate in. Then when the flexible use activities are over, the park still offers an adequate space for large gatherings or entertainment. So it's a bit of a mixed use park, which can work well with limited space available. So could that idea be incorporated into a policy statement where it gives us that flexibility?
And Georgina,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but you're looking for a policy statement that could you just phrase it briefly?
Yeah. So where we have a well-rounded park, open space and recreation system. So that kind of wording where we are not stuck with the metrics completely. So if we decided to do something that was a little more flexible, that the pros plan would support that.
Thank you.
Okay. The next would be, and this is especially for Harbour Hill. The desire to have more open space for the exclusive use of trails and wildlife viewing is not new in Washington, Western Washington, where it is common for 80 to 90% of residents to support that form of recreation. In order to make sure that we effectively prioritize the protection and acquisition of open space for trails and wildlife viewing over the course of the next 6 years, perhaps we can look at how that might be accomplished. At the start of the report on page B, which covers goals and policies, it states, quote, the city has a strong interest in the conservation of sensitive lands, quote. To me, the land in Harbour Hill is now becoming sensitive because it is disappearing very quickly, which was pointed out in former Mayor Kit Coon's presentation in December. It was also mentioned in the survey analysis, which said, quote, many residents are concerned about the space of ongoing development in Gig Harbor and want to make sure the city protects access to nature, trees, and open spaces for both people and wildlife, quote. Also on page 66, under the open space management plan, it states, quote, develop a citywide open space management plan to define goals for stewardship of local ecosystems and outline the best management tactics to sustain environmental function. Can we add wording that identifies Harbour Hill as being a specific area of concern, as it appears to be reaching a tipping point when it comes to future access to natural areas? There are also concerns about stormwater runoff impacts with the removal of so much forested land in Harbour Hill, and which some homes near me are experiencing on a slope that is showing possible stability issues with homes sitting immediately above that slope. The next is, I didn't see any reference to forest management, but it's possible I missed it. I've heard that the City Council is interested in having an urban forest management plan. Should the pros plan update also reference the need for forest management, especially when it comes to wildfire mitigation strategies, given our warming climate? On page 83, it states under key projects that we are acquiring additional neighborhood parks in the Western area, and future park sites are needed in the northern and southern urban growth areas. What is projected for population growth in the UGA? Page 84 is the suggestion for a splash pad, multi-sport courts, such as tennis and pickleball, and additional space for community events in addition to the sports complex. Is that in addition to the sports complex? Page 99, Appendix A, there is a reference, and this speaks to what Mary was discussing about Austin Estuary Park, that I think should be park at Tawalkath Estuary. 105, what is Harbour Hill open space, which is 20.14 acres? I have no idea what that is. I asked a couple of people and they didn't either. Page 110, there's been a mention of having beach access at the old ferry landing. Is there any such plan, and should it be included in the pros plan update? And the last one will be nice, like happy to know, is Shore Park. The Shore Park maintenance considerations, it states none, but the park is in very poor condition, especially the turf, the landscape beds, and the planted trees due to drainage issues. Given that there seems to be a discrepancy between the assessed standard and the actual level of maintenance, can we not change that so that Shore Park can receive the grading, drainage, and planting work that it needs? That's it.
Georgina, we are so lucky to have you on the commission. That was so thorough and spot on in so many places. Thank you for bringing it up.
People have done a lot of work on this, so I decided
you did too.
I'll give it my best.
You did. And you raised a lot of points. We're going to listen to the other commissioners. I hope you don't feel like none of them got passed over. If we don't get a chance to cover them all, we will cover them with as we can, email or one-on-one.
That's fine. Mhm.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Gonna volunteer to follow that one up?
Oh, yeah, I'll jump in here.
All right, Will, you want?
Yeah, no, I thought overall, the pros plan, the draft read well. Good document. There are a couple, one just quick observation in the discussion. I think it was maybe in one of the appendices, Austin Park. I think it refers to daylighting being completed, and the Donkey Creek daylighting is done unless we're talking about the next culvert up. So, I mean, I think that was just kind of pilfered from past documents. My biggest concern here is along the lines of open space acquisition and actually the lack of a plan. I think, in my opinion, it's probably one of the more important things that the city can do, and that not only open space acquisition, but also waterfront property acquisition. So, the point was made throughout the document, and I think Georgina pointed this out on several occasions here, is that we kind of give lip service to it. We speak to it, we say how important it is, and then there's no plan. There's no plan for acquisition, there's no strategy, nothing. And as we all know, with the pace of development, the stuff comes up for sale and then it's gone. And without having some dry powder in reserve where we can jump on it, or at least we're conducting surveys for those people who own these properties on an annual basis, saying, hey, please come talk to us if you're interested in divesting of this property. So identifying what those properties are from an open space acquisition, both waterfront and just conservation property. I think it also speaks to the why this really needs to be more a much better highlighted or identified policy is, this also plays to the trail connectivity desire. It also connects to the desire for opportunities for exercise and biking. So it really ties into a lot of things. And so I would say that this is lacking in identifying how we're going to move forward in the next 10 years on that, to do two things. One is provide that additional connectivity to the north and the south, the different parts of the harbor, the UGA, but also to preserve what we know as Gig Harbor, the reason for why many people visit, the reason why many people live here. People who live on the north and the south extremes, they're never gonna have a harbor there, but they certainly probably appreciate being able to come into the downtown and see it preserved kind of in the state that it is. So I want to spend some time speaking, I guess, Matt, with you in more detail on this thoughts, or the commission in general. Also, I'm passionate about, and I hope that while I serve my time here, that we can get some progress in the Donkey Creek fish spawning operation. So, very one sentence in the discussion about that, yet we highlight Chum Festival as a festival. And I remember bringing my kids to it when there actually were fish in there, prior to the abomination upstream that basically caused the destruction of that whole operation. So I'm very interested to see that come back in some capacity, whether that's city participation with the fishermen, or whether that's city on itself, or just some level of encouragement there. And then I will wrap up with, I think that's my biggest comment. But overall, good document. I just would really want to see the conservation property and waterfront property acquisition plan put forward as a priority and funded, frankly. So I guess we can talk about that on the upcoming CIP list.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there will be definitely an opportunity to do that too. Matthew highlighted a couple of spots to do that. Stephanie or Luis, you want to?
Well, for one, can you hear me? Because my connection has been in and out and up and down, and I'm sorry, I've been logging in and out trying to fix it.
No, so far so good. Yeah, you're good.
Excellent. I've changed rooms and changed modems, and we'll hope it stays. In disclosure, I got about halfway through it from when I got home. Sorry, but I did the best I could in the 48 hours I've been back.
Back.
So I concur with Will. That was one of my top comments, was about waterfront acquisition and strategic acquisition, and deciding in advance what our strategic priorities were for the things that we've been working on that we're likely to. So connectivity is the overall theme, but connecting Fishman Trail and other things that that make the whole community a whole. I've been more impressed lately, partly from my PennMet time, but that because the city parks and PennMet parks are not distinguishable, city people and county, unincorporated Pierce County people using both sets of facilities, not distinguishable, that having a taking the whole community into consideration is really important, and how we're now going to interact with the new Land Conservancy Trust group that's just formed, and Rails to Trails are the leaf line type folks. A lot of cooperation possibilities that would make the whole park world and open spaces and all of that more integrated and more complete, and that it's worth talking about that and describing some of that cooperation, or at least the intent of it, or the desirability of it. I guess it's not an intent, but it's desirable to be working cooperatively with those groups. My other thing was about events, and this maybe is a question for Jeff, or Matthew, you may know too. When the city is hosting events in the parks, Paddler's Cup would be one, but there's others, right? There was just a bicycle event that went through both city and county properties. Do we get involved in those in any way about trying to encourage how the parks are used and that the parks are used? I mean, what do all y'all think about that? So encouraging these events and uses of our public spaces.
So Luis, I don't know if we'll entertain the question and really get into it, but are you suggesting that we need to talk about our roles with events and talk about whether or not we need policy in that area?
Sort of, yes. But I really, is it any job of the Parks Commission to have any role in encouraging the utilization of our parks for these events, of which Paddler's Cup or the Chum Festival or any number of other events are samples, but maybe not the only things? That this is a way for us to have utilization of the parks. And are our park spaces set up and conducive to hosting those kind of events, which are very good for community building and for heads and beds and other other purposes.
We'll have to see if we get to that priority as a discussion tonight. Let's I'm not trying to sideline it.
No, that's all right, but that was on my mind.
Okay.
That parks get used for all kinds of things, for movies and concerts and Veterans Day events and chum festivals, and hopefully with the tribe. I also, Mary's comments, very supportive of interacting with the tribe in our park spaces. And so are we encouraging those? Do our spaces encourage those interactions?
Great. Thank you, Luis. I do appreciate you bringing that out, actually. So hopefully we'll be able to touch on that here as we kind of get everything else out on the floor here. Anastasia, are you still with us as well? I don't think she was, I think. Stephanie, you want to go ahead with any comments you might have?
If I unmute, yes. It's a minor detail, right? You can't hear me yelling at the cat that way, so that's better. The joy of working at home, right? Okay, so I do have, and I realize it's probably because I'm sort of new to the game, but I did have a couple of questions about, first off, the executive summary, and I'll just let you note the questions and maybe we can answer those at some point. But there's a number of references to the existing service standard for natural areas relies on a numeric acres per capita metric. We're recommending not to use that metric. So, and that comes up a number of times. And I don't know enough about what those metrics do and why they're important or important to ignore. And I think that that needs to be clarified at some point, because I don't think I'm the only one that won't know what that is. So I think that's important, because that really stood out to me, that there were a number of them were like, oh, we're just not going to do that. So, so why do they exist, right? So, so that's important. And then I wanted to make note, I concentrated a lot on chapter 6, obviously, because that's kind of where my area of expertise is. And then also on the individual parks and some of the historic features of those individual parks. And I can send Matt my my notes on those individually, if that's helpful. Just because there's some historic information that's not correct in some of the descriptions.
Right.
And so I want to make sure that we got that right. And then there's some that just didn't have descriptions at all. And so I added a little bit to that where that might be helpful.
Yes.
In chapter 6, and overall, I would just say that there is reference to historic structures within park areas, but no reference to a preservation plan for those park structures. And I think that's absolutely essential. If the city's going to continue to purchase properties that have historic structures on them, we've got to make sure that we have a preservation plan, or at least are partnering with an organization that can do that. Because if you don't do it, then they all fall down and or get washed away in the tide, and then that's a real problem. So we have so many organizations that basically program city property in historic structures that I think that really needs to be thought through. So that's that was my big comment on chapter 6. And then, of course, I just had some individual comments on the various parks. And I don't know if you want me to get into detail on all of that, but that took a fair amount of time. So, yeah.
But talking about preservation, I was pretty impressed with the high tide mark in Fancy Park, and thinking, oh, well, that just perfectly demonstrates why the net shed needs repair.
Yeah.
And maintenance. But
yeah.
Yeah,
they're kind of built like clam baskets where the water comes in and the water goes out. So it's kind of a smart design. But on the other hand, if you have collections of artifacts and things like that in there, it's not conducive to long-term care of those. So that's something definitely to be concerned about. We're actually looking at raising up the schoolhouse because it's so close to the creek, and preparing for tidal rise. Even though it hasn't hit the museum yet, it's pretty darn close. So it is something to consider. Yeah.
Great.
Oh, but that may be the round robin. Did you get a chance, Ben, to really?
No, I mean, obviously there was a lot of stuff here, but I agree with a lot of it. There was a couple of things that, on page 77 on the trail and corridor access systems, it mentions, working in coordination with the city's active transportation plan. But it doesn't really mention when that's supposed to be updated, who updates it, and how or who should use it. And so I think that could kind of be expounded upon. I'm really in agreement with the conservation element of this. That was definitely a theme we heard throughout. I agree that having a strategic plan moving forward should be touched on, if not outlined. Preservation. Thanks for bringing up the metrics in the executive summary. I didn't even think about that, being part of that conversation throughout, and it was like, good point. Yeah, I agree with the tribe. We've, I think, really just opened the door on, building that partnership and recognizing all of that. So I think this could be a very nice opportunity to kind of help move that next step forward. Also, the idea of an urban forestry plan, everybody's, the talk is trees and preservation, and I think the development of an urban forestry plan could really help in identifying and preserving, could be a nice tool in helping along the preservation and conservation of these forest stands that we have left.
And planting new ones.
Planting new ones. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that ties into interpretive elements. That was the last thing I didn't mention, but including interpretive elements, whether that's tree identification, native plants, that sort of thing, or just interpretive markers in historic sites, like why is Shaw Park named Shaw Park? And, we can add that information really easily.
So Ben, I think you were just starting to repeat some items and maybe bringing out some highlights. Maybe we ask you and Steve, anyone else who feels like they have a sense of what might really need commission discussion tonight. I think we need to pause and see what are these items. Maybe Steve, you have a response on the conservation efforts and where you think we might be able to say more. Maybe for our all benefit, a little education on metrics and how important and where you see them emerging in this plan. Anybody else want to suggest we have a priority to talk about? I mean, all of these were valid. They'll all be written down and responded to. I can guarantee that. So I said metrics probably are worthy of Steve's explanation, and conservation strategies, maybe where we might be able to do more, or if you feel like maybe we missed an aspect of it.
So you want me to hit those?
Yeah,
For
please.
those two to
There,
start,
and we'll see if others have more discussion items that they really feel like we all need to talk over.
For sure. First off, thanks to everybody for taking the time to read through the document and dive into the details. I know there's a lot of content there, and I know you didn't have a whole lot of time to really spend time with it next to your bed and really enjoy word for word everything that was in there. And just to offer some ad-lib comments on the front end before I get into the topics, as you can probably tell, there are a wide and diverse range of interests and desires in the community for what is a parks and recreation system or parks and open space system. So part of the art really of putting a plan document together is trying to pull from all of those different pieces, do the sausage making and make it make sense. So it's no surprise that there are areas where you all find the need for additional focus. I certainly appreciate getting that direction. So thank you again for that time. With regard to the metrics and the service standards, I'll start there. Just for way of reference, the former plan really relied on one basic metric, which was acres per thousand. So the concept there is you have a bucket of property called acres, and that is allocated by type, whether it's waterfront or community park or a special use. And a certain amount of that bucket is categorized for each park type. And then basically you're saying our target is X, Y, and Z for those three park types. So the notion of acres per thousand as a standard has some history. It goes back to the mid 80s, basically, with the National Recreation and Park Association, and they put out some guidelines. But at the time, it was absorbed as formal direction or recommendations. So they've been entrenched in the world of parks and recreation planning. There is movement away from the notion of acres per thousand as the sole metric. It still provides some utility. It provides some concept as to how to think about your park system and how properties are provided and distributed. But by itself, it's a very blunt tool because you can easily imagine a system where you've got one really large park, let's say 100-acre park. And if you're just using acres per thousand as a metric, that one park skews the numerics for the whole city if you're looking citywide. So part of it is
a refinement of what you had in your old plan to, one, assess where you are in relation to the metrics you set back then, and two, how relevant are those metrics for the things you're trying to count. So the first part about how you're doing is a fairly straightforward process of, again, plugging in the new information of here's your inventory, here's your population, here's the output. And for community neighborhood parks, you're doing really well. You're pretty much on target. But you look at the other classifications and you start to wonder, I wonder a little about the utility and relevance of thinking about acres per thousand as a metric rather than some other tools. So for example, special use waterfront or natural areas. Waterfront's going to be waterfront. You're not going to do waterfront outside of waterfront areas, and they're unique in their own right. So having access to waterfront is a policy, it's a goal, and it's just a little harder to capture as a numeric. The same holds true, I think, for natural areas and open space, where it's all about the resource. It's not necessarily about the resource in relation to the number of people who live in the city. So if you've got quality forest land, if you've got creeks and watersheds that you want to manage and protect, those should be considered through policy and strategic action, such as an acquisition strategy or a conservation plan. So just using numerics themselves as an acres per thousand concept doesn't come across in a clean manner. So for that reason, I've suggested in this plan that we maintain the neighborhood community park, kind of the active park space, as a numeric, and then move away from acres per thousand for those other two classifications for waterfront and natural areas. We also have inserted a whole nother suite of level of service metrics that rely in part on the Washington Recreation and Conservation Office's handbook, basically on park planning, that says you should think about your levels of service in terms of public satisfaction. So we've pulled in reference from the community survey about public satisfaction as a data point, effectively. We've looked at distribution through GIS analysis to say who lives within a reasonable distance of park or open space. And in this case, we're defining that as a mile travel shed. So if you're within a mile from an access point to a park or open space, that's great. And that helps define how that level of service metric gets represented. So there's, and then also quality and conditions. So through our conditions and assessment piece that we did from our on the ground work, that helped inform the real-time kind of snapshot in time of how each park is doing in terms of quality and condition of all the amenities, and then rolling that up to an average for the whole system. So again, it's a bit of it's a snapshot in time that you can then trend over time. So we've tried to blend those various ways to think about levels of service and metrics to move a bit away from just acres per thousand like you had in the old plan. And granted, the executive summary is a bit blunt when it does talk to that, so we can certainly wordsmith that and make it more clean. But it's like you're giving the punchline in the executive summary without the context, and there's a lot, as you can tell, there's a lot of context in what I'm describing. So hopefully that provides some information to help you think about this, and hopefully it makes more sense of what's in the document. And before I touch on conservation areas stuff, let me just ask if that makes sense or if there's follow-up questions. Stephanie?
I have a question. So you've mentioned acres per thousand, but what is the like how many acres per thousand, or what is that metric?
Yeah, so on page 51, there is a table at the bottom of that page that identifies the standards, the acres per thousand from the old plan. And then on page 54, the recommended adjustment to that, which really is just focusing on neighborhood and community parks at 5 acres per thousand.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have one question then on the open space and the way the metric works for open space then. In fast forwarding it, you know, in the case of Harbour Hill, we fast forward it like the presentation of Cocoon and, you know, all the different forested areas that are going to disappear, just going to disappear. So when you have a metric, you might have the metric, I guess, for the whole city, but do you carve it out into, well, what does this metric look like for open space in the 3 main areas of our city, the waterfront and the uptown area and North Gig Harbour separately, looking at, well, how are they doing on open space?
So the way it's structured right now is it's intended to capture citywide. It's kind of a global assessment at that acres per thousand metric. Certainly you can look in a more refined manner based on smaller geographies, but it creates a different set of challenges for what's counted, how it's counted, and what that ultimate demand is going to be going forward. And ultimately, can you afford what you get out as a result of that sort of analysis? So it certainly can be included. It's not in there right now. And I would take direction from the commission and staff to see how that gets represented.
I think it's the only way you can see perhaps a trend of the way an area of the city is going. And also it's not just that we lose the possible use of trails through the open space in those areas, but the wildlife is just disappearing in North Gig Harbour because of all the development and the development to come. For sure.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. And the other piece to it is how this plan relates to the comprehensive plan and the land use zoning and comprehensive designations. And if the comprehensive plan and zoning say, you know, small lot subdivisions for large areas, it potentially creates some conflict where there should be discussion with internal staff to figure out, you know, what really are core community priorities and how does that translate back up to the community or the comprehensive plan.
And the comprehensive plan, I believe, is that this year that it's been updated or being updated? Is that right?
I don't have that info.
Yeah.
Matthew spoke on that a little bit last meeting. You want to go ahead, Matt?
Comprehensive plan does have annual updates, and we'll be sure that our pros plan fits to it, but we can also hope our pros plan gives some direction for some future amendments to the comprehensive plan.
Right.
You may insert strategic language to speak about open space planning and strategies and to think about sub areas or basin areas, because we have several watershed basins within the city. Sometimes you use a piece of geography that has some kind of environmental function that we're able then to say it needs its own attention. That's a great policy statement, and we can make environmental statements in the pros plan. I would come back to saying Steve was charged and we're charged to come up with a citywide pros plan at this time. And you will find that this is a stepping stone to get some sub areas addressed, but you don't typically get sub areas addressed in your pros plan, and it wasn't part of this scope.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Georgina, I'm not jumping into one of your questions, but I do want the commission to think a little bit tonight about talking about geography of the city. There was a question about UGAs. We're going to get back to conservation, but I just wanted to identify this straight up. There was some questions about what's the population of the UGA and are we meeting their needs? We need to think whether or not the outer rims of the city, for example, are partially served by Penn Met. Shamel Park comes to mind. They're not in the current analysis, unless Steve corrects me. Travel sheds were done with our assets in mind. And it's kind of interesting that we went ahead and said, we need to grow and have some more recreational access in certain parts of the city, north, south, and west. And Steve suggested in this plan 3 geographic areas. You can do that as a commission if you feel confident in that. I would say that we lack a little bit of the analysis of how our other partners are meeting their needs in those areas. And I would prefer that we be generic about how we pursue our needs across the whole city and not have 3 geographic areas. I would concur that we are lacking in parks acreage. Steve's analysis, your analysis, commission, has been good, that we need to grow some neighborhood and community park access. But I'm not comfortable personally with it being geographied, if that's a verb, at this time, saying it's in the west, it's in the north, it's in the south, because that would negate the fact that there are some other parks in those areas. And there's also a lot of HOAs in some areas that are doing the playgrounds that Georgina brought up. So I am not one to say that we definitely should have 3 geographic expansion areas. I believe that the metrics is encouraging us to have more recreational access. And when we're ready and we look at the CIP, you'll see that as your staff person, I took that approach. I didn't go to, there needs to be in the north, west, and south. I said we need to grow recreational access. And I think that's consistent with the language Steve gave us. You lack it on a neighborhood community level, but it hasn't been determined exactly where. And I think we need to be careful that we don't tie ourselves down to saying only in one area, because trends change, densities change, big conservation effort could occur in a certain area, and it may be that we don't actually see the need in that area or the opportunity arises somewhere else. So I just coming back to the fact that this is strategic at times to be citywide with your assessments and to speak to the need for localized analysis, but that has to be done carefully, and the pros plan is not going to do all of that. So, Georgina, I'm on the point that you mentioned, could we say more about Gig Harbor North? I think we need to say more about our community needing connectivity and waterfront access in the harbor being important to the entire community. I think it would be a little bit of a mistake to call out one neighborhood over another or one section of the city over another and say it particularly needs, Gig Harbor North particularly needs. And that's my opinion. It's up to the commission to direct otherwise, but I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I see what you mean. On the trails, the connectivity, that has to be a whole city. There's just this concern about the environmental impacts now that are starting to show up in North Gig Harbor. And there needs to be a heads up about that. And I see a pros plan as a way to have something in there to forewarn about, we need to be taking some cautious steps here.
We'll get some buy-in from the rest of the commission, but let's turn to Steve to give us some more on our conservation efforts that are in place, and maybe if there's areas that we could do more. I'll point out the one quick answer to that question about Harbour Hill open space. You asked that one, Georgina, and that's about an 8-acre parcel, and it's fronted by Shaw Park. Shaw Park right now is only 1 acre in size. It'll have a small expansion, but it's part of a large piece of property that came to the city of Gig Harbor. It's somewhat critical areas and wet and forest, but it's 8 acres, and it goes all the way down, not quite behind Swift Creek Elementary School. You probably know the property, and there is a trail, informal trail there. But and we do need to clarify in the plan that there is an Harbour Hill open space, about 8 acres, fronted by Shaw with 1 acre. At one point, there might have been reference to a Harbour Hill Park, but that is an old reference. I found that out, and that is really the Gig Harbor Sports Complex, totaling over 22 acres.
So it's what we here in North Gig Harbor call the wetlands. So I do know that the boundary of Shaw Park goes down into that area, and also the part that will be annexed also shows a boundary that goes down into that area and then stops so far. I don't know where it stops. So that's where
we get out there together. We'll get out there together, Georgina, and figure that out.
So that's where Harbour Hill open space starts, is where the boundary of the park is. Then that becomes Harbour. Oh, okay. We've been calling it the wrong thing.
That's one thing that became very apparent, even for someone who's been here for a long time, is that there is definitely not clarity in naming conventions, in locations, and in boundaries. that became glaringly apparent, and that's an area we could, focus on helping, identifying and clarifying for residents. But yeah, back to the conservation element. Yeah, I agree, that basing it locationally or, neighborhood based is, it needs to be done, but I don't know if this is the tool to do it with. I agree that, it can be referenced in it, but I mean, I see what Matthew's referring to as, viewing it as a citywide aspect. But as Georgina mentioned, it's like, okay, this is the areas disappearing the quickest in, most densest part of town. Like, this is an opportunity to do something about that. And so, I see that.
But I do think it needs to be citywide, because there are also, I mean, we've talked about Donkey Creek. There are other places where it's also maybe in smaller areas, but there's other places where it's also disappearing. And I hate to see us start to focus on one neighborhood over another neighborhood, or one area over another area, when it's a 6-year big picture strategic plan.
Well, it ties into the development standards for the city too. So, I mean, because there's like the 20-foot strip on either side of a high density neighborhood. So I think that, that may be an opportunity for connectivity that we are overlooking. But I don't know if the city is open to changing their development standards to require a greater amount of space around these high density neighborhoods, because that has proven to be an issue around here in many, many instances. And I think we could definitely stand for, increasing that footage. But I have to say, the developers are all against it. I mean, in my neighborhood, I live right behind Target in Harbour Crossing, and we tried to do a pocket park here with some of the lots that were not developed. And not only was the developer against it, but the neighbors were against it, because they did not want to park right across from their house. And I couldn't figure out why, but then I realized they're coming from very urban areas where parks become tent camps. And that was their thinking. So I think that's something that's also a consideration.
Steve, I'll kick it back to you if you want to pick up on the concept.
Well, it looks like Will has a comment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
go ahead, Will.
just a real quick comment that, yeah, you can get these open spaces as part of development through your development code, but that's why you end up getting these kind of piecemeal things. They're just kicking off the wetlands wherever those happen to be. They're really not looking for walk corridors. I mean, there's some of that planning is involved in some of that and tries to coordinate it, but I would say that this really it reinforces the importance of having a plan for acquisition, for trails, for open space, where the city is targeting the properties, and you're not just getting the remnants, the fat cut off, the gristle cut off and handed over to you. You're actually targeting properties. You have that on a list, you lay it out, you work with Pierce County Conservation Futures. It can be done and should be done, because then the city will pick up those valuable pieces of property to provide all the connectivity, all the open space, the things that we want, as opposed to being left what the developers are willing to give. So yeah, I think it's super important.
And that connectivity can include wildlife connectivity, to Georgina's earlier point. Having wildlife corridors built into our city as the inevitable growth occurs should not merely be aspirational, but should be part of the plan. It's just one element of the plan, right? That it ticks off a box of why a parcel is desirable, and what kind of funding we need, and all of that fits together.
Is there consensus that wildlife corridor should be referenced in the pros plan? Anybody feel they can object? Nope. Okay, we'll do it. Steve, that might be one of those things that you can speak on. What can we do about conservation and be strong about it?
Yeah, so good conversation. And the plan does, as you know, reference the need for a strategy for conservation in a couple different places. primarily on page 66, where it calls it out specifically, a land acquisition strategy. And as you probably could tell from the plan and this conversation, there's that balance of how high up this plan looks and how granular it needs to get. So it's the notion that Matt mentioned about potentially not wanting to even identify geographic zones for future recreation opportunities lends itself to the conversation about conservation needs and the need for acquisition planning, in that this plan, again, tries to stay at a fairly high level, but to dive to the level of specificity required for some real discussion and decisions about land acquisition approaches, areas of interest, types of properties to secure. To me, that's a finer level study that could be a follow-on study that also pays attention to the sensitivity of the private landowner and potential conversations with city council about executive session land discussions or property acquisition discussions. So it would be possible to put additional language in, but it sounds like from the conversation that there's less interest maybe in targeting things on a map because of sensitivity or just lack of content at this point. So we can certainly add more robust language to the need for an acquisition strategy to really dive into what Will and Georgina are talking about. And I'm totally happy to do that. But that's part of the reason why we kept it at a higher level, is because we wanted to also maintain some level of sensitivity and recognize that additional work is needed to have that community conversation about what sorts of properties does the community value for securing and acquiring. Is it a priority to acquire property adjacent to what you already own versus standalone properties? So there's a whole series of kind of questions you can ask of the community and as a commission to help refine what a strategy is, and then take the next step of trying to find those properties. So it's definitely a series of steps. But Matt, do you have any other comments on that?
I like what you just said, and I think outlining the steps would be an advance for us to have that listed as these are some things to do to have an acquisition strategy. You might help us, Steve, think, is that different than, or I don't know if I can't really come up with this, the difference between it and open space planning. Acquisition is very specific. I think open space starts to speak about networks, starts to speak about the functionality of critical lands. So corridors come to mind, but is there a handful of policies that you think you could help us evaluate? Maybe, we might be able to say we need 2 in each of these areas, and one that's a choice because it's maybe really a way of showing prioritization. Do we feel like there's any way to prioritize any of the aspects of open space planning and acquisition theory right now? Or do you have a way to help us? I mean, I get what you're getting at. I think some of this is you got to come up with some qualitative criteria for the future, and we haven't done that. But we might be able to say it is important to us that we protect habitat, wildlife, that we protect open spaces. So to the point that they become, somehow we could say these are critical considerations in acquisition.
Yeah, well, and to that point on page 76, the first 2 policy statements kind of touch on that, and maybe they need to be reworded or strengthened, but the notion of open space protection and also developing open space corridors to enhance the system overall are things to pay attention to. We can certainly add additional suggestions about what to consider in an open space strategy to lay out some of those next steps. But at this point, I don't know if I feel I know enough about the Gig Harbor sense of values to define what is or isn't part of the collective notion of conservation, if you understand what I'm saying. So it's like, we haven't had that conversation through the course of this process. We've touched on it and we've asked questions about, is conservation important, or is it important to acquire more? And those were yes and yes, but that's as far as we got. So I know, Will, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Just real quick. I mean, my thought on this is not to try to identify a piece of property, but rather what I would emphasize or ask is that a conservation acquisition plan be part of the capital plan moving forward. So if we can spend $500,000 to plan what Shaw Park's going to be 2 years from now, then it seems to me like it would be a high priority to park $100,000 in the capital program to identify or to lay out exactly what we're talking about, to do the work. But my recommendation would be find the money, put it in the capital, let's have it done. That's it.
Well, that's a great, strong statement. I will just point out, and we may get a chance to go to the capital improvement program and elevate our conversation here. I will support, and it's not about me, but I think you're right on that we should make it a priority. I wouldn't put a plan, though, a plan document within the capital list. So I think what your comment is right. It's just maybe, in my opinion, not that we want to put it in the CIP. You just want to state that it's a really important priority, because a study in a capital comprehensive plan, for example, which is the whole city's full guide for its future, that's not a capital item. So let me just be a little nitpicky on that respect and say I wouldn't put it there. I hear your point, like, well, you're committing money to Shaw or some other pet project, maybe somebody might say. Yes, because we have to list capital projects in case they get funding, in case we can do it.
So
I think you need to
Yes.
state that the planning of acquisition strategy is critical follow-up to this plan, and it needs to happen. And you can put a benchmark, like needs to happen in budget year 22 or 23, and that's okay to suggest that you're really wanting to explain an expectation of the park system to operate.
Matt, can you explain? I understand what you're saying, but I wonder, we have master plans in the COP document. And I guess what's the difference between a master plan for a specific park and what is essentially a master plan for conservation lands?
Yeah, great observation, Mary. Well, you're dealing with a capital asset that will require a master plan in order to show, your financial connections through the whole process of turning it into conceptuals and programmatic of that. Like, as you move forward into site planning, you have to have this foundation for capital expenditures. So that's why a master plan for a park site is part of a capital project.
Okay.
Whereas a system evaluation is important, just like this pros plan, but it's not something you put in your capital list because you're not developing a piece of capital off of it. I could lose this argument if we decided, because you could say, hey, we're going to develop an open space system. That's a capital improvement. That's a systematic thing that needs money. And we could go ahead and start to approach it from that perspective. You could, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but the first response of a planner like me is to say, that's not a capital project. That's an aspirational community goal that needs, like you guys are bringing up, development standards, and it needs a number of zoning considerations, and it needs a lot of stormwater considerations and things that go beyond the capital list of a parks program. Now, we're parks and open space, so I'm not all right on that. I just give you my background why I wouldn't put a study in the capital list.
But the study
Yes,
could go in a pros plan. The study could go in a pros plan.
Yeah, and the recommendation to have one, I did start to say you could set a goal for it to be a high urgency, but of course we can't commit ahead of council what staff will do, and so you really have to speak about it aspirational and being a critical nature. I think I went too far to say direct us to have it done in 2022, because it's really not up to anyone who's not on council to direct ultimately what we can spend our money and time on.
Or maybe
Remember,
there's
we're
some
advising.
balance though there where because Will's right, if it's purely aspirational, then it just drifts off into the future and no tangible action steps are made towards linking our open space plan to these other issues, connectivity and conservation and wildlife corridors, types of things. So maybe there's some middle ground there somewhere where we can make the recommendation of what we hope they will commit to clear enough that we can say that we are hoping that they will fund a plan, an evaluation and study to create a 20-year acquisition plan for these specific purposes and do something like that. And it does take time. This is not something we cannot, there's no chance these things will be funded in a 2-year budget, right? They just won't. So, but having a solid plan and those corridors semi spotted, as Will said, where you can really look ahead and say, yep, this is the kind of land we want in the places that we want it, that have the features that will make it attractive. That is worthy of funding over multi years to acquire those parcels when they come
I think
available.
you guys are giving us good basis for some enhanced policies in this area. So I'm not cutting it off, but I promise you we will have that response.
Plus, Stephanie had her hand up still a little bit too.
Okay.
Yeah, I just was wondering if this got a little more complicated than Will intended, but I don't
Yeah.
know. Because I
Yes,
think
probably.
that there's criteria that the checklist, the criteria for what makes good open space and what makes it a good connecting piece of land. And that if that criteria is developed, that is a gauge by which one could judge the opportunities that come up. That may not be what Will intended, but that's kind of the first thing that came to my mind, because there's certain land that works for that and certain land that doesn't. But I do support the idea of having sort of a global view of the area and looking at, if there's strategic connecting zones between large tracts of open space, that might be a really good thought to put into play. And I don't know where that lands in the pros plan, but I certainly think there's a lot of pretty specific things in, a number of these sections that I think it could land, at least that suggestion or that priority could land in one of those areas with the urban growth that preserves and set asides on 79 or something like that. So.
Right, and Ben, can I just jump in with one other comment here? So in other communities where we work, I'll offer a compromise idea, and that is some jurisdictions choose to put in a list after their capital plan that is non-capital projects. And it's really just that. It's a list of non-capital projects, such as a land acquisition strategy or an urban forestry management plan or an open space management plan. And that way, at least it's captured in a list in the same area where all the projects are noted. You can assign dollars to them. You can reference preference or priority, but it's at least captured. And maybe we want to go that way or maybe not, but I just wanted to offer that as an option.
I like that
A good
idea.
idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think that actually touches on a lot of the things that were brought up tonight. But also bring it back to the page 76 of the open space preservation and wildlife resources goal, perhaps creating a policy on the identification of these properties that we have been mentioning, because throughout it, there's a lot of preserve, provide language and not exactly identify these pieces of property that provide these benefits that we're looking to preserve. So I think that is an opportunity to help bolster what we're trying to go after with this goal, is the identification of these as well. Jeff, welcome. As far as, let's see. So we touched on conservation, we touched on the cultural tourism aspect, strengthening that a little bit. The tribal references, and what might, yeah, go ahead, Luis.
One thing in there that I'd written down, but then I forgot. Since we have this new sister cities effort with our other cultural bits of heritage, I think that could be stated too, that those are all pieces of the layer cake, as we talked about with. So let's include them. Of Scandinavia and Croatia are part of our cultural history.
Right, right, absolutely.
I want to make sure that we're clear that I don't necessarily want to strengthen the cultural tourism emphasis. I want to change it to more of a that we want to be more embracing of our history and our culture rather than lead off with, we're doing a really good job with cultural tourism, because we aren't.
Area of opportunity.
Can I ask a question about the historic resources on page 81, since we're sort of on cultural tourism topics? There's some language in the historic resources section that says, encourage the Harbour History Museum, Boat Shop, Fisherman's Club to make more cultural programs and activities accessible to the public. Encourage the owners of historic sites and structures to provide increased public access. I don't know if this is language that was generated by the commission, by the discussions with people that Steve had, or exactly what, because there's no language quite like that in any of the other sections. And while I think it's great to encourage and assist, I think you got to be a little bit more specific about what that really is, because working with these cultural groups, it's like everyone wants to do this stuff. It's the resources to be made available to make it possible that is the hurdle. And that may seem like it's a fine line, but it's a real thing. And so I want to just make sure that we're not trying to tell organizations what to do, but find a way to have that language be inclusive and encouraging. But I don't know how the Parks Commission is going to help do that. And if there's some thinking about that has taken place in my absence, forgive me for the comment, but I would love to know the background on that.
Yeah, really quick answer. It's a carryover from the last plan.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Super easy.
Not to say that it might not need additional editing or refinement, but it is a carryover.
Okay, cool. Well, I think we can do it. We just want to do it right. Yeah.
Stephanie, are you suggesting that there be an amendment to that to speak to the fact that resources are necessary, or do you feel like it was a critical statement?
On one level, it feels a little critical, but it may not have been intended at all like that.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it could be, I don't know that the Parks Commission has resources to be able to help make that stuff happen. I mean, the Arts Commission has a grant program. LTAC has LTAC in funds, so I don't know that it's really a situation, unless it has to do with putting amenities in the parks that help make this stuff happen, helping the Fisherman's Club reconnect the hatchery system and stuff. I think that's awesome. That would be really great. And
well, it doesn't sound like it's objectionable language. It sounds like it's aspirational. And, there was a question earlier on about, can the Parks Department, can the Parks Commission, can the city is really the question. Can it help with events, and can it help make things more accessible? And I think that this is powerful language that you would want to retain, and realize it's not up to the Park Commission to do so. It's really a community charge to partnerships as well. Nonprofits can be part of this. Scholarship programs can be part of getting better access to things, so that there can be harbor tours that maybe even that are partially funded by a nonprofit. So there are things to get out and do that make things more accessible to those who don't have, and we're doing them, like with the Communities Paddlers Project, right? Like we're getting people waterfront access. So these are bold statements. I hope they're not taken critical. I think I heard that we need to be a little bit more sensitive about cultural resources. And in this instance here, it may come across like we want to present them well and as openly as possible. And it might need to be refined in the language so it doesn't read like a criticism.
Yeah,
That's
I think there's some minor edits that can take place that can make a really positive change.
Yeah, Stephanie, thanks for bringing that out. And chapter 6 has come up a couple of times tonight, and I regret to say that I gave this chapter to one of our expert communicators, and that would be Laura, and she has said she'll be working in chapter 6. So you all deserve to see her edits. I can't say when I'll exactly have those. Steve and I have a really quick time turnaround, but I'll get real practical with you that if you saw language that concerns you, or you think it could be read a little differently about cultural tourism, we will take your suggestions for sure. It's not your job to edit the document, but if there are comments and areas that really concern you, please send those red lines to me. The challenge is I really need those by the end of the week or very early next week. So you could spend your weekend on it, but it's not your job to edit. I just don't want to miss things that are really important to you. On that point, we're going to transition in just a bit to capital improvement programs, but I want to be sure that we've heard your highest priorities. And this is the challenge of the meeting at this time. We can't cover everything that has been brought up. We have to document what you brought up and show that we're responsive. That's my job. But I do want to hear if there's something you heard that leads you to feel like you can't support, if there's any significant enough objections or status that you feel like you have that you need to bring to our attention. Now recall, you are a consensus seeking body. So you are never all going to fully agree on everything, but is there something here that's really tearing you up to support the pros plan? And I think you've given us good conversation on a couple of those fronts, but is there anything that you feel like I better let you know now, I need to see some direction change? Yes, please, Stephanie.
So I'm just gonna beat the same drum, but I think for me, what I hear a lot of, and I have seen in the last few years, and while I am not opposed to it at all, I think the land acquisition is really important, but it's kind of killing me to see a lot of these historic structures not being, not getting the resources that they need to be stabilized, like the Wilkinson barn and things like that, that have collections in them that, you know, we could really make those amazing community spaces if we put those resources in that direction. But we've emphasized land acquisition, and I realize you got to take it when it's available, right? So I get that, but somewhere I think that has to be a big part of this plan, is to be good stewards of the properties that we have acquired.
And the people indicated that too in the surveys, that their priority was for us to maintain and maximize our existing properties.
Nice.
And the people supported that.
So we will work on a stewardship statement and definitely on historic preservation comments about structures.
And I wonder if that can be incorporated into the maintenance portion of the plan.
Good suggestion.
Jeff has.
It's probably a couple things, isn't it? Because part of it's maintenance so that the structures don't fall down and they're able to be utilized. But another piece is what I was talking about earlier. Are they suitable for community events, and do they help us build community? Is it an asset that is actually contributing value to the community and isn't just a structure on a parcel, right? Beautiful as they are. And the Wilkinson barn's a good example. You know what? How does it become a value-producing asset and not just a maintenance expense?
I'm hearing direction for criterias for acquisitions and criterias for acquisition of structures and being, I guess, careful with your assets. Ultimately, don't put money into, I mean, I'm not going to put you guys on the spot tonight, but we've got the Masonic Lodge. You know, you've got to figure out, how do you use such a structure and at what cost? There is some instructions, and I think Steve might be good at helping us list, here are some next steps to going to another level for criteria making and things to consider. All right, so we got some direction in that regard. Anything else that we need to do for you to feel like you'll be able, you know, you're looking for in order to support the plan? If we covered the items that you're most concerned about tonight? Cool.
That touched on a lot of really good ones, I think. You know,
The
some of
the plan's really good. So all the comments we've brought up have to do with refinements as opposed to, or further emphasis as opposed to, oh my God, this sucks and we have to wipe that section out. I mean, there's none of that, right? So
no, it doesn't sound like you have objections really with what you've read. There are areas to clean up. I, for one, don't want the totem pole to be listed as a totem pole. I'm really excited to have been part of a recent awareness that that's a photom pole, you know? We're getting there as a community, I like to think. Glad to be with you. Jeff has his hand up, and I know we're going to transition to CIP, but what do you got to say, Jeff?
Oh, I was just going to follow up on Stephanie's comment, and I've heard it a couple of times about conservation areas. I just want to throw out the concept that I don't think it's the Parks Recreation Open Space Plan or the Parks Development Fund sole duty to acquire these conservation properties. Historically, a lot of properties have been conserved through using stormwater funds. So, you know, share the duties, share the responsibility. So something to think about.
Is that mentioned at the tools portion at the end? I don't see it in there, is it?
I don't believe that we did capture that, to be honest.
Not that I recall.
No, and I'm glad for that broader view. And I think that we should be referencing how important it is. I think Steve and I know this, but it'll be important to write even a paragraph to say, hey, this needs to inform and be informed by the comprehensive plan and by transportation improvement projects, you know, that the city keep in mind all of these policies when they're looking at critical areas and open space planning. Yeah. So we have a little lull because we've covered some heavy stuff. I'd like to bring up the capital improvement plan and tell you that it has been a little bit rushed, and I regret that. But I'm hoping in the end what you find is a very comprehensive list of capital improvement projects. It is not every project, but it's every project that is in the current budget and that was in the past pros plan. Maybe we had nomenclature wrong, but they are accounted for with the best cost estimates that, as your new city staff, I was able to locate. The projects include things that get a lot of attention, like the Harper Sports Complex, and it actually goes ahead because we have the detail and breaks down that into 4 different aspects of or phases, and showing people that there's a progression of funds that we hope to expend on these projects, and that you, in the end, you develop a project, but in with different elements. So way I reorganized it just even today was to try to show your improvements has their own subtotals, so that the Gig Harbor Sports Complex has its own total, but it's not a singular project because we are not able to always commit to that full final phase, at least with exact dollar amounts, right? So what you'll find in a capital improvement program is very specific allocation and plan to expend in the first year and the second year. That has well been documented in your, even in the plan you got on Friday and what I've just resent, consistent with the budget, consistent with the acknowledged projects that we're under contract to deliver. Then you start to move into that area of show those other aspects of the phase 2 and phase 3 of a project. But those, some of them are not fully cost estimated. So we do our best to almost placehold in this document dollars and expenditures that are expected for different projects. The version that you haven't had time with, but you have just today, I want to point out that it starts with, and Terry, I don't know if that's something you can open, but it's been reorganized to show that it is representing this plan with 2 really important top projects, not prioritized, but they just happen to be there at the top. It's local recreation access to be something we go off to acquire, plan, and develop. Now, going back to this conversation of we are going to look to try to meet the needs of our community's recreational needs, not necessarily by acres per 1,000 people, but definitely looking at the fact that we are underserving with population growth coming, that there is a need for local recreational access. So it's just generically listed, but it's listed that we will, over the next 6 years, try to pursue at least 2 of the 3 in the plan in the next 6 years, opportunities to improve local recreation access. So those are the top 2 projects in your new revised CIP project list. Local recreation access acquisition. So there's a letter A for acquisition showing 2 of those. There is also a line item for developing local recreation access. So that would be like that master plan allocation of funds. And then finally, a little bit of development funding, even though it's seemingly low, 750,000 and pushed down to 2027, it's still showing a progression. And we may have to zoom in, Terry, to show this, but it's showing that as the years are going by, one, we've acquired some property, then we started to use some of the funds for master planning it and ultimately developing that recreational access that's in the plan. I'm talking quick, I could be confusing you, but I don't want to pause until I point out that what's new for probably a lot of you to see for the first time is a conservation strategy. It's a whole category in itself. So
Any way to
we
blow that up
actually-
just a bit, Terry? Sorry, Matt.
Yeah, please do.
Sorry, my computer battery was just about to die, so I was
Ah.
panicking here. So you want it to be raised up? I'm sorry.
Actually, if you could zoom in just a little bit more.
Okay.
I was starting off by showing you that this first top 4 lines are about local recreation access. But in the grouping here, the next category is conservation strategy, and it's in bold on, I guess, about line 6. And it's actually just it's identification that we need to work at this. It doesn't tell you what properties, and it doesn't say what criteria. We've just talked about how important it is to refine that. But it's suggesting that a $4 million placeholder be put in for acquisition of strategic conservation properties. And again, I can't show it in 22 and 2023 without being more specific as to what properties, but we can show that we're going to commit monies and hope to commit monies to this effort ongoing. What we are specific about below it is North Creek Conservation Phase 1 and Phase 2. The Park Commission hopefully has seen this and given your input on it. The city has already engaged in an application through Conservation Futures for Phase 1 and Phase 2. So what's being shown is the actual funding, the cost for those 2 very specific items. There could be more acquisitions along North Creek and behind Donkey Creek areas, and several of you know of some opportunities, but we aren't committed to those, and we certainly don't want to price those ahead of them actually getting into a process with appraisals and so forth. So we don't list those. Those are included in that $4 million set aside for conservation strategy. Now, where will we get the $4 million? Well, the city is saying that's our aspiration. It's not necessarily $4 million of our Gig Harbor taxpayers' money from excise tax or otherwise. It is a combination of sources, but ideally foundation money and ideally grant money. And we always look ahead in our capital improvement program to say, well, what grant programs are opening in what years? So they help populate some of the years a little heavier than others because we know there's a conservation grant opportunity coming. That's just an example, but I wanted you to speak to what we've talked about tonight on terms of metrics. We identified acquisition of recreation in general. Again, I did not put geography on there, and I need to know if you guys want to go back to having it set for certain parts of the city. And then we did have a conservation strategy. If you felt like, boy, this is really needing more money because property is expensive, we could suggest a higher number. This total CIP totals now at the bottom, if you just scroll down to about $42 million. So it's ambitious. Let's go down to that bottom and see the totals. And you can see in that column in bold, $42 million is the total of all the projects listing our properties, hopefully more clearly, including the Harbor Hill open space. You can see that we thought there needed to be some master plan and program development for that very property that Georgina was bringing up. Shaw Park is listed. You can see that here towards the bottom at only 75,000. So that's an adjustment since you've seen it, Will, within a realization, and that was on my fault. I didn't realize Shaw Park was largely developed and developed by private dollars. So really master planning it and even doing some activation of what the city still wants it to activate. And that's not really the repairs you were talking about, but the money needed to come down. So that's only showing $75,000. I talk quickly. I just wanted you to get a sense that the categories and the properties are now covered. There's trail sections above, but at the bottom you get to see your totals, and you can see that in an acquisition, we've got 13 million of our total set aside for acquisitions, and master planning is at a pretty low number. Of course, some people would say that's too high because planners sometimes are undervalued. but development coming out to 28 million, and that's largely Cushman Trail and the Gig Harbor Sports Complex and the home port projects at Ansich, things that the city's actually quite committed to early on in this CIP. I don't know if that overview helped you. Some of the numbers changed dramatically. Jeff and I talked about Maritime Pier. At one time, that project was talked about as being multi-millions, but I went ahead and suggested we're not really clear where we're going with that. And so I did lower that amount because Jeff and I both thought that it was committing a little bit too much in the future at 3-something million in the previous plan.
All right, you got a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
I have two questions. And
Okay.
my first question is on the Cushman Trail. Does that include the phase 5 extension of the Cushman Trail?
It does. So Terry's just going past.
Where's
it
it
at
at?
the
There it
moment.
is. Okay.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I couldn't spot it.
Right.
Okay. Then my next question is there's at the very bottom, there's something Wheeler water access. What is that?
So maybe Jeff or Terry could help me with the geography of Wheeler. It's a street end that the city has opportunity to have access to the water.
Sure.
So knowing that waterfront access is something that our plan speaks to, it is there, and it's also with the old ferry landing that we expend funds on giving public access. I don't know if parking is usually an issue, but it might be that this was about a shore wall, or it could have been a trail. I don't know for sure, certain.
Yeah, Wheeler Street itself is, if you're not familiar with it, it's just west of where Crescent Creek empties into Gig Harbor and south
Oh.
of Bernhardson. It's a very short roadway, but we own the right of way all the way to the water. And so there has often for many years been talk about developing that into something as simple as a bench, or maybe something a little more like a kayak launch on high tide. If you're at all familiar with that area of town, you know that the tide goes way out at low tide. It's a long walk through the mud to get to the water. So that's what that
Okay.
concept is.
Thank you.
There were other questions. I know at one point, Wilkinson Farm stabilization came up, and I wanted to point out on Wilkinson Farm, it's showing right. I think it's showing here. Barn and farmhouse stabilization is shown at 305,000. So I'm not saying at all that we addressed all preservation needs, but I know that one specifically came up. Are we going to commit money to ensuring that asset is protected? And I like to think we addressed that.
So I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So two things here, and because I can't see the top, I'm assuming this is like 2025. But the, yeah, 2025. So there's a plan then for a master plan for the Harbour Hill open space, which we previously have called the wetlands, for 75,000, and then Shore Park master plan and program development for also 75,000 for the same year. Does this have anything to do with something I was suggesting very recently? That was to extend the boundary of Shore Park to include the Harbour Hill open space, so that the Harbour Hill open space had a higher level of protection. Does that have anything to do with that or not?
It really doesn't. It's just, but there is an acknowledgement by putting them in the same year to try to coordinate that and have an understanding of where the right kind of planning area would be. Georgina, there isn't I wasn't aware of it, but there wouldn't be a reason not to talk about making it a park. It is all considered park land. But the levels of protection, it really came down to the practicality that both properties deserve attention, and they deserve attention ideally to be coordinated. So that's why they're in the same year. If you have a policy direction to try to higher protect open space, that might be a policy statement to make, but that wasn't implied here.
Okay, yeah, because I've been told that the current designation for the Harbour Hill open space of critical wildlife habitat is not a very high level of protection for the land. So I was thinking that if the boundaries of Shore Park were expanded to include the Harbour Hill open space, so that Shore Park would therefore be a much larger park, but that its needs might be better addressed because it's then part of a park, especially since it is a forest, and will probably come under the urban forest management plan if that is executed by the council, which they seem to want to do. So.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Jeff had mentioned something about that, I think prior to this meeting. Was it in reference to that it's HOA owned or something to that effect, that land?
Not the Harbour Hill open space, it's owned by the city.
There are 4 parcels, I believe, the city owns. They're almost 100% wetlands.
Right.
Buffers. There's also the entire west side trail around the wetlands is not owned by the city.
So
We
the
have an
entire
easement.
trail around the wetlands is owned by the HOA?
No, the wet trail that's on the west side of the wetlands
Okay.
is an easement, a public easement for public access, but the property, underlying property is owned by the property owner that, like for example, Swiftwater Elementary owns the property underneath that trail. Village of Harbour Hill owns the property underneath their section. So the underlying parcel owner actually owns the property and the city just has an easement.
Okay, I get it. Yeah, yeah. But the actual wetlands are owned by the city.
Correct.
Okay.
Will has his hand raised.
And just 2 quick questions. One, I guess, follow up on your answer there, Jeff. So is the city obligated for maintenance of that, or just has access rights? Who maintains it? Who pays to maintain the trail?
We maintain, the surface of the trail itself.
Okay. And then other question is, so the commission, 2 of our meetings, two separate meetings, 2 separate occasions, we had folks speaking to the commission about how they want to see Shaw Park develop. And yet I see that the master plan for Shaw Park here is out in, I can't see the date, but I think that's what, 2025 thereabouts. Thoughts on moving that up? I know we can't pay for everything in 1 year, but it seems like there's a lot of interest around the development of Shaw Park, and as North Gig Harbor develops, just a lot of folks wanting to see that turn into something. And I'm just concerned that maybe the planning is a little too far out. Is there a reason why it's that far out?
Thanks for asking, Will. It's really a great call for the commission in terms of community priority. I pushed it out a little bit personally because I came to understand that we're waiting for the developer to do a second portion. Maybe we ought to master plan and be certain that we're getting what we want, because it does sound like we're already dealing with some consequences of it not being per our own design. Again, I put it a little later because I thought we were waiting for them to do their portion, and then maybe we would come in and talk about if there's some unifying features or some way of addressing needs that didn't get addressed to the development agreement.
Yeah, I think having input with those properties, the development agreement properties, I think, having any sort of input on those would be ideal before they get handed over to the city. I don't know how much input they'd be willing to take from the Parks Commission or from the public at large, but I know Georgina has mentioned a few times about the overall product of the park when it is handed over to the city and what kind of issues exist when that does happen. So, but I can imagine that people might have a hard time doing a master plan for a property the city doesn't even own, in total. Because I don't think we take full ownership of it until the development is complete.
It's really a complicated problem. First of all, the existing park, as it now is is not in very good position, in a good situation, because it was not planted properly. And I was told that this is the second time it was planted, what you're seeing right now, because it wasn't right the first time. So the drainage wasn't taken care of. So the trees were put directly into hard pan that was probably opened up with a jackhammer, and not enough soil was put in. And so it took a while for you to be able to see whether these trees would thrive or not, because I guess in the first year or so they did. But then, of course, once they hit the hard pan, they didn't. And so we've got a real problem with the trees. We have a problem with the mud that is accumulating, not just from the rain, but also from the irrigation. So it's a year-round problem. And so now, when you look at it, there's all this moss growing. There's like bright green sort of mounds of moss growing in the turf. What makes it complex now is this is existing. People, when they walk down the trail, the path, which is usually the only thing people use for Shore Park, by the way, it just isn't being used. They walk down the path to get to the other side. So they go from Borgen, they go back to the wetlands and the trail to Sentinel. That's the major reason that it's even used. So the problem is that it looks awful, and people have to walk through the muck when they walk through that path. Now, the next thing is with the annexation. So I know that there is a development agreement with the developer. And so I would honestly hate to see the same incompetent, I have to say, way of planting and landscaping the second part, because I wouldn't like to see it repeated again, what we've gone through the first time. So the thing is about the timing then. So yes, a lot of people would like to see Shore Park function with some particular use that the city or that the neighborhood supports. But now you have the problem of there being major construction in the village at Harbour Hill, and all of the noise and the dust, etc., that will create. When is it a good idea then for a new amenity to even start, given that I don't know what the quality of life conditions, so to speak, will be like until that project is either finished or close to being finished. So when you look at 2025, that may not be unrealistic, at all, given these different issues, but it would be nice to have an idea of, what we're going to do with this park. Certainly the existing park at some point has got to be addressed anyway, but then you don't, for instance, with the annexed area, you don't want a developer coming in and putting more turf down and more trees, etc. And then you're going to have an amenity come in where those people might have to dig it all up because it doesn't fit their particular amenity that they've been awarded. So then that's good money after bad. So it's a complex issue.
It is. I agree with you, Georgina.
Excuse me a minute. Matt's transitioning to his phone here. So.
Oh, his laptop die too?
I'm doing okay, guys, but I'm
Okay.
listening in, and I appreciate Jeff might help me lead on CIP subjects. He knew I needed his rescue this hour.
Okay. Mary, sorry, you had your hand up.
What I was going to say was kind of where Georgina ended up. I don't see a lot of point in master planning for Shaw Park until we're done developing, until we know what the parcel looks like and the construction is complete, unless we could discover some way that there was still negotiating abilities with the developer. And I think we're out of time on that. So I guess to me, the 2025 is probably more reasonable.
I do think in the meantime, I would like to see though something done with the existing park.
I think those are two separate issues.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
So you can't wait that long on the existing park. So, okay.
That's a great conclusion. I would totally concur. We've got maintenance needs. We've got that list maybe that Steve was telling us at the end of the capital improvement program. We can put some priorities that are important And we've got maintenance of existing assets really coming up in this conversation. Shaw being one of them.
Yeah. Wilkinson Farm, Masonic. So does the Masonic Lodge, would that be a maintenance issue, or was that, a capital improvement?
Well, remember that the Masonic Lodge is still scheduled to go through a public process to determine whether or not the city wants to keep it and rehabilitate it or tear it down and reuse that site, that part of the property for another use.
Okay.
So I think that that's going to probably answer a lot of questions as we go through that process.
The other one I slightly take issue with is the Old Burnham Properties. As far as, is it master planning for that one? It's a great open space as is. And, considering we have literally buildings, that are in need of roofs and, sitting over water that are becoming disrepair, to spend money on master planning a fully functional open space as opposed to prioritizing, repairing a roof on a existing historic structure, such as the farm part or the barn in the farm park or the net shed. I would take issue to, prioritizing that over one of those other items. But, I mean, that might be as much, I mean, there's an existing trail. It's rough as is, but, where did I see that?
Yeah, I think really the Old Burnham Properties is just open space. And the question is, does the city want to do anything with that open space or leave it alone? I mean, there's no parking there. If we do anything with it, we've got to establish some sort of trailhead, some sort of, at least identify how we're going to get cars parked in there. And if we establish a trailhead, what are we going to do to the property? Anything? Maybe not. And it's limited in what its use because the conservation requirements for the property that were put on it before it was transferred to the city.
I mean, like no permanent structures are even allowed on that property, correct?
Very limited. I mean, yeah, you could have a bridge going across if you want to, that's a structure. You could have a bridge going across the creek probably. But you couldn't put I don't know if you could put a picnic shelter. I don't know. You couldn't put a building, no. You couldn't put a interpretive center or something, no.
So I'm curious to Ben's point then, Jeff, why would you prioritize 75 grand for a plan on that property when you could just spend that money on properties that are in more dire need of it? What's the driver? Why now?
Just a question of, do you want to leave that property? If we take it off here, essentially what you're saying is just leave the property alone. Don't do anything with it. Leave it as open space that's not accessible to the public, which is fine. But if you want to make it accessible to the public, you need to do that master planning.
And it is significant in size, if I'm not mistaken.
A little over 20 acres, I believe.
It's actually part of the original Burnham homestead. You could probably know that, Jeff. But we've been mapping homestead plots, and sure enough, it's all part of the original homestead, which is kind of a cool thing.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And Soundview Forest Park is part of the original Jerusich homestead too. Strategic parking with homestead plots, which is cool. Yeah.
And these are just city contributions, not full project price outs, correct?
No, my understanding, these are full project estimates, but like Matt said, I mean, these are just in many instances just trying to put a placeholder. This total would include funding from many sources, including city funds, grants, and other sources.
Gotcha.
In my new capacity, next week on the 27th, I'm attending Congresswoman Strickland's federal grants, the new federal grants that are available for our district. Is anyone from the city participating in that, or shall I take notes?
I don't know if anyone from the city is participating in that.
I will take notes.
Great.
Do take notes, yes.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay. Matthew, you want to kind of redirect us here as far as where we're at on this?
Well, I did hear about that Shaw. Did we get a consensus that we leave it in the year that it's at? And then the Old Burnham, it was really a direction whether or not you guys feel like it needs any public attention. It may be so low a priority to you that you'd rather it not be on the plan.
Well, can we agree though that the maintenance issues with the current portion of shore will be taken care of?
Yes, I think we really need a strong statement to that effect that maintenance
Right.
levels are of concern, and we can bring special attention to Shaw.
Great.
So I'm not sure if there's consensus though on Old Burnham Properties. Whether that's something to keep in the 6-year horizon or accept Old Burnham Properties as strictly open space, not accessible to the public.
Can I ask a question about that? And I confess, I'm having a hard time seeing the teeny tiny type on that. But I think when I looked through it before, there was one property acquisition for like 480,000 and another one for like $4 million. And I don't know if I'm seeing that correctly or not. And you can guide me if I'm misinformed. But it seems to me that if the city's spending $4 million on a piece of property, we should probably get it open to the public as quickly as possible.
Well, again, I'm talking about the Old Burnham Properties, which we already own.
Oh, so these are different than the
These are
other?
different. Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Terry, would you mind increasing the size of that to about 150 or something? Great.
I'm sorry, Jeff. So where exactly are the Old Burnham Properties? Because I thought they were the ones that were kitty corner to Donkey Creek.
No, that's the North Creek Conservation.
Okay.
Old
Okay.
Burnham Properties is along Old Burnham Drive, Old Highway 14, I believe, that goes down from the intersection of Burnham Drive and Woodhill Drive to the northwest, down to the outlet of McCormick Creek and right alongside McCormick Creek. There's 6 parcels totaling about 20 acres there.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah.
So Jeff, is this Burnham Properties master plan likely to be a trail, or is that what you have in mind? That
It's going to be something low impact.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't think of what buildings are on it.
On the
So
Old
what-
Burnham Properties,
Yes.
I don't think there's any buildings on the property.
Okay, so
Wow.
that's why I can't think of any, because it's all forest.
The only building that's even near there is either a house on the periphery or a well house that's owned and operated by Washington Water.
Yeah, that's the Washington Water Service does have the well house down there, and then so the road needs to be stayed clear so they can access that. I think is the only stipulation. It's across from like the boat storage facility that's over there that you can see on the side of the
Okay.
freeway.
Oh, okay.
And
I can't see the year now where the master plan was being proposed. Was that 2023? I can't
It
remember.
was.
for Old Burnham,
Yeah, that's 2023, right?
correct.
I don't know. It just feels like we've got this land and it's not being used.
And it's significant, 20 acres, nothing to shy
Yeah.
away from.
Yeah,
And, that is directly in line with what the, community asks
Exactly.
for.
yeah.
I don't take issue with it, considering it falls right in line with, community desires from the surveys.
Right.
But, as far as like the prioritization of it over, existing
Yeah, if the
construction.
year moved off to a later, we left it on the list, but moved it, the master planning to a later time period. Jeff, is that, if it's on the list, is it allowed to be reshuffled as the council makes priority decisions?
Yes, I mean, that's where the council would provide input at that point, and whether or not there's opportunities, as Matt said, for grants or just strictly council priorities. It just needs to be on the list somewhere.
Public Works Director.
So maybe the compromise is to bump it out a little bit so that it's not taking funds away from the urgent projects right now.
Yes, you could definitely do that. I think that Matt did a great job of balancing out as best as he could. It's realistic, the total amounts for each year. Because it can be a challenge. You don't want to have huge spikes some years and lulls in others. But yes, you could definitely push it up.
So what is it taking money away from specifically if it's done in 2023?
Georgina, that's a great question, and it helps illustrate we're not taking money from anything by listing these projects. I wanted to bring up that I don't call this a catch-all and list everything, but I would suggest that if it's something you want to see happen, it's important to capture it. It's not that we have a fixed pot of money that it's taking from, it's being aspirational to show it. I do think it's an important project. If you think we're ever going to do that work, or say a demand shows up, it's nice that we foresaw that master planning was needed. I hope I answered your question, that it's not a subtraction from another project. Right.
So maybe I'd like to ask Will, because I think he was the one who suggested that it be delayed, I think. How is Will feeling about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if really this is just a placeholder, it's not supplanting money from another project, then I think, proceed. My question was going to be, and I think I heard the answer, is if you had the 75,000 to put towards a different project that's scheduled for that year, where would it go? So I'm in favor of leaving it where it's at if it's not supplanting money for something else for higher priority.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree.
I do appreciate this conversation. I think that we're educating ourselves, myself included. Like I would say, Jeff brought up, it helps council set priorities. So if they will look at our 6-year plan and say, well, it didn't show before. So that would be the issue that I would bring back and say, it's not excluding or taking from other properties, but it does suggest that you want it getting considered. So just have that in your final conclusion as to what year. And if a compromise is pushing it down a little bit, that's fine. But I do think a placeholder is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
I support the placeholder and probably bumping it out to further years, but the placeholder to me is important because it gives us flexibility. It gives the city flexibility.
Well, I hope you guys have gotten the sense that you are giving direction for the next 6 years, excuse me, of budgeting. It is not absolute and inflexible. And you as a body, and we will be working together to set some annual even work plans. Priorities emerge and we can make some suggestions to council at any time about budget priorities. So this is your guidance. It reflects the plan in terms of saying we need to acquire recreational access on a local community basis and conservation. And then it addresses what we believe are all known projects at this time that have come up through different community needs and policies. It's not everything, but we will list that this needs to relate to forest management and open space planning. I hope you're starting to see the citywide listing that impacts parks, open spaces, and ultimately strong goals and policies, which we will spend the next few days getting you some drafts so you can see that we're being responsive on your areas of concern.
So Matthew, just kind of start wrapping things up a little bit. Potential, minute edits or can be sent your way up through Friday or through the weekend.
I will always take your edits because they're going to help me. So I know Steve and I need to do the heavier work on policy. That's where we'll focus his attention, but I'll take them through Monday morning.
Okay. So if anybody has any edits,
What we need to do is turn around the draft by midweek next week so that it becomes a public document at least a few days, and certainly the weekend before your meeting on the 2nd. And
Right.
unfortunately, January is already going away.
right.
We've
Okay.
been working in these 2-week spurts, and you guys are playing well, and I appreciate your patience. It's not necessarily ideal, but we're accomplishing a lot.
It's kind of the tail end of our input and recommendations here. So I just want to make sure everybody has the opportunity and to feel like they were heard. I know we lost Anastasia at the beginning of the meeting, so I will make sure to reach out to her and provide her the same information. Yeah. So does anybody have any unresolved issues that they feel has to be vetted or put out there right at this moment? Looks like we did a pretty good job. It was pretty thorough. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for the patience. Thank you, Steve, for joining us tonight. Do appreciate that. I know this last part was a little, but
Really good discussion, though.
It was a good discussion. I agree. Yeah. So, and then we'll expect to see, hopefully a final revised draft, like Matthew was saying, the end of next week, to be included in our agenda packets. And then open for the public comments as well. And then moving forward, we'll hopefully provide a recommendation to council at our next February meeting. And I think that's kind of wrapping things up on the pros plan. So yeah, if you have any further comments or concerns, feel free to reach out to Matthew or get in touch with one of the other commissioners to help kind of vet those or questions can be answered. What else am I missing, Matthew? Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you very much for that.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
This is a great, it's a great work that we're sharing. So it's a great birthday present in some respects to me. Public meetings, believe it or not, are something I do value. But yeah, I'm excited to be working with you guys on this. We covered enough that if we're just able to give it this one more week of attention, I really believe we're advancing a great product that will help the city's park system.
I absolutely agree with you.
It's
Thank you for all your
very
help on this. Oh, and I do also want to mention,
impressive
oh, sorry. Sorry, what was that? I missed that.
I said it's very impressive how quickly this has gotten done and so thoroughly. Just seriously, a shout out to you, Steve, and the city, and to the commissioners that helped make that happen. What a lot of work. And now for Matt thrown in at the last hour. Good job, everyone. Truly.
I'm really impressed. I've said this before. You guys have put in a lot, and your reviews tonight really spoke very highly to me, and they inspire me to do this work.
That's nice, kind words, and makes me really happy that you are a new parks manager. That's reassuring. Those words are reassuring, Matt. They really are. They resonate very well. Speaking of parks commissioners, though, we are losing Mary Barber as a parks commissioner vice chair. She was appointed to the city council.
Woohoo!
Good job, Mary.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just this is my last meeting. I had to ask if I could stay for this meeting, and so the mayor and city manager agreed that my resignation is effective when we adjourn this meeting. But I just want to say this has been a real pleasure, and I am so looking forward to seeing what you guys can do and what you continue to work on. And I have enjoyed working with everybody and look forward to working with you again. And I also want to add a huge appreciation to Steve, but also to Terry and Jeff for their work, especially the last 2 years while we've had no Matt in place. And I am so impressed with Matt Keogh. So look, I'm so excited about where parks are going to go in Gig Harbor with the people that we have in charge.
Well, good luck with you on the city council. I know they appointed a good one. So
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you know of anybody that's within city limits or UGA that, you know, would like to be on it, there will be a call to the public to fill that position on the Parks Commission here shortly. And if any of you had in mind of becoming vice chair, or, you know, we'll appoint that position or we'll vote on that position for our next meeting to fill that. On that note, yeah, look for the agenda packet next week and comments to Matt by Monday at the latest, but ideally Friday. Yeah, on that note, I move that we adjourn the Parks Commission meeting. If there's a second.
Second.
Sure. All in favor?
Bye.
So adjourn. Thank you,
Thank
everyone. Have a
you.
good night.
Good night, all.
Bye, everybody. See you in a couple weeks.
Bye.